Hello, and thank you for joining me for an overview of the AirSim3D C-560XL's cockpit and cabin in Explain. Pleased to have you aboard. This is the second of our informational video series, and if you have not already seen the first one that looks at the aircraft from the outside, we encourage you to please view it. And just to set expectations up front, we will take an in-depth look at the cockpit and cabin to get a sense of the realism and authentic emotion the aircraft provides, but we will not talk about how to operate each of its instruments or how to actually do things like takeoffs or landings or complete instrument and system procedures. Those are all covered in our more focused, shorter and topic-based tutorials, and we recommend viewing them in their numbered order because each one builds on information that was provided in a previous tutorial. And just a quick aside before we begin, you'll notice that some of the external aircraft visuals are much better in this informational compared to some that you see displayed in the first informational. Welcome to the beta world. As Explain has got better, some of the bad artifacts that we see have now gone away. Things are much better and cleaner, but that had nothing to do with the actual aircraft texturing itself. So just some context and housekeeping cleanup there. And speaking about context, if you looked at our first video, you will have noticed that we talked a lot about why we did things in a certain way for this aircraft. We'll do the same in this informational too, and we'll talk about the results of those design choices to help you make a choice about whether this aircraft is right for you. But secondarily, and also frankly, we're just simply tired of seeing some reviewers talk about some personality-based and completely undefined standards, all while they fumble about trying to get things to work in this highly replicated aircraft. We mention this only because in those reviews we can clearly see that they have not done the homework and studying that is required to flawlessly operate this 99% bug-free product. And allow me to repeat that. This is a thoroughly tested, 99% bug-free, 95% authentic aircraft. Not many products are so upfront about being unequivocal about their product quality, but we are. But that's our standard. Is this misplaced bravado? No. Instead, it comes just from the quiet confidence and belief in the product we deliver. We do not shy away from that truth. So are we saying we are perfect? Well, we never have, nor will we ever say such a thing. So yes, there is a possibility that you may find a legitimate issue. We acknowledge that. But that being acknowledged, fair warning. A pilot is very likely to get frustrated if assumptions are made about how things should work in this aircraft based on how things worked in other aircraft. So please do not make that mistake. Each aircraft is different. If something is not working, there is a high probability that some step or procedure was missed. But that being said, don't take our word for it. This is a quote from a real C-560XL pilot mentor working at a charter company that is using our C-560XL to run familiarization training for their C-560 pilots. So please, it is in your interest to spend time to learn how to fly this highly replicated, authentic, study-level aircraft for hours of trouble-free, consistent, reliable, and bug-free flying. Take time to study the online Pilot Operating Handbook or the POH, or view our video informationals and tutorials. This jet has been thoroughly tested. We actually delayed the launch for over 3 months just to get it done right. Our promise is to never treat you like a beta tester when flying AirSim3D products. Also, releasing many version updates is not really a badge of honor for us. We want you to have a fully functioning aircraft from day one. This is a VR-ready, study-level aircraft by our definition, and if you are a reviewer and want and need help and coaching to become proficient before you do a review, please contact us on our support site, and we'll be more than happy to help you become a proficient C-560XL pilot. If you walk away armed with facts and truths about this jet to be informed and have an independent assessment of the aircraft for yourself, then this cockpit and cabin informational will have served its purpose. To begin, as I have been panning around the cockpit, you may have noticed that this aircraft has a G1000 instrument, and you may have compared our cockpit with other Citation cockpit images found online and are therefore wondering, why on earth does this aircraft not have an FMC? I've never seen one with a G1000. So, okay, have you got that off your chest? Okay. Let's start this G1000 FMC conversation by first stating some facts. Fact number 1. There are 4 Citation XL aircraft variants which often can get mixed up when viewing online cockpit images, which then may lead one to therefore think that our cockpit does not match those images and therefore it is quote-unquote wrong. What we have is the XL variant, opposed to the more glass-heavy XL Plus version or the older XL version. So let's first keep those differences in mind. Next, fact 2. The XL we built maps to a real XL version that we often visited at Boeing Airfield here in Seattle, which we used as our real-world reference. Fact number 3. Unlike highly standardized airliner cockpits, business jet owners personalize their aircraft and cockpits a lot. Our real-world XL reference model was no exception. Notice the Avidyne nav system installed in this image of its cockpit. It also had an FMC. But having both glass and FMCs in real-world cockpits poses a big replication problem for us. Why? Simply put, X-Plane requires just one flight planning system, so we had to choose either or. And by the way, complicating things further was the fact that the C-560XL has its own very capable and sophisticated autopilot, which of course we had to replicate. So now you see our problem. We had to A, choose between installing a glass autopilot or an FMC, and B, we also had to reconcile that the real XL also has its own autopilot, which we had to add also. This presented us with quite a design challenge. And to solve this, we allowed the sim piloting experience to help guide us. That was and always will be our number one priority. And so we had to ask ourselves this fundamental question. What is the main purpose of having a G1000 or airline standard FMC in any X-plane aircraft? And the short answer is, at the most basic level, they are both primarily used for and required by X-plane to load flight plans into the sim. Yes, after they do that, they can do other things, but basically, first and foremost, we needed a customer-friendly method to get a flight plan into the aircraft or it would not work. Then your next obvious question is, well, if you had to choose one, why did you choose the G1000 over the FMC? There were two good reasons. The first one, when we read many comments made about the use of the default FMC, the feedback sounds something like this, and I'm paraphrasing here. Wait a minute, this aircraft uses the default FMC. Ooh, that's the default one? That's not good. I wish they had created a custom FMC instead. Okay, so that means that there's a preference for a custom FMC instead of the default one. And that's understandable because most everyone is always calling for quote-unquote more realism. Okay, fair enough. But then, reading about highly customized FMC efforts, then the feedback sounds something like this, and again I'm paraphrasing here. The custom FMC in this aircraft is unlike anything I've ever used. It's very complex and it's intimidating, and it has a very steep and long learning curve. Months later, I'm still trying to understand it and get it to work. So neither of those two feedback sentiments, first that it's lame because it uses the default FMC, or second because it's complex and intimidating, well, neither of those were what we wanted our customers to experience. For us, the more reasonable customer-friendly experience strategy seemed instead to be, well, let's use the method that allows customers to easily add flight plans to the aircraft so they can get up and flying quickly instead of forcing them to fiddle endlessly with custom FMC learning, FMC bugs, and pages and buttons and menus. Get flying quickly. That was our primary goal anyway. And rationally, the G1000 is easier to load a flight plan to get flying quickly. And as a bonus, since we saw the Avidyne glass system in the real jet, then us choosing the use of the glass G1000 in the sim allowed us to check the box that maintained aircraft authenticity too. So with the G1000, a pilot can create their flight plan in the G1000 using a more autocomplete system anyway, but then pilots still have the option to use more fun options like Little Nav to create fully complex flight plans with SIDs and stars and save that and easily and quickly load the FP into the G1000 and get flying. That's the primary goal. Oh, but now having said that, here comes a twist in the story. Having installed the G1000 in the cockpit, we then ask our pilots to do something quite unintuitive after they've used it to load their flight plans. In our training POH and tutorials, we ask pilots to simply ignore the G1000. Wait, why? Well, first, be assured that it's not like the instrument can only add flight plans. On the contrary, it's fully functional. But still, we recommend ignoring it 99% of the time when you're in the cockpit. And the reason for this is, well, remember we said that the C-560XL has its own autopilot and MFD? We have replicated those instruments, and therefore we want pilots to use the aircraft's custom and authentic autopilot and not the G1000's AP, just to get a more authentic and immersive experience. Again, you can use it, but we don't recommend it. We want you to use the aircraft's AP, not the G1000's AP. With that rationale in mind, we asked the pilots to ignore the G1000, except in two cases. Number one, flying VNAV, or number two, looking at airport maps. Aside from those two tasks, every other G1000 function is available in the jet's own custom instrumentation, and that includes the highly customized and exact replica of the autopilot. Our design was to configure the jet in a way that is authentic, which we did, allow pilots to get flying quickly, yep, did that too, to use the aircraft's actual fully customized instruments, check that one, done too, and all while providing a truly immersive and authentic, sophisticated flight experience. So yep, achieve that one also. Make sense? So I hope we can now all agree to get over the jet not having an FMC, because frankly, it is configured to get you up and flying quickly, has customized instruments to use for a more authentic C-560XL flying experience anyway, and the jet is modern enough not to need an FMC. This is just an opinion, but FMCs are old school and are standard fare, which airliners use mostly anyway. The AirSim3D C-560 on the other hand is a modern, highly customized and individual business jet, just like its real cousin. Moving on, let's now address the next elephant in the room, and it has to do with a quote from a reviewer who said, "For the price, I expect the circuit breaker panel to work." Okay, aside from that statement that ignores the hundreds of other highly customized systems and functions that are fully replicated, which, by the way, we offer for about half the price of the most expensive aircraft out there, here is why we chose not to animate and code the circuit breaker panels in the C-560XL. First, there are no checklists that require pulling any fuses. There is just one step for the pilot to check that all of them are in. Second, it's obviously not because we did not know how to animate or code them. Sorry, I have to chuckle at that one, but it may be implied. And third, actually the main reason for not animating and coding them was the FPS cost that every pilot would be hit with. Don't trivialize that. There are over 200 fuses, and coding each, well, we couldn't do some and not the others. Coding failures into each one would add complexity to what is already a very complex aircraft. And the FPS hit of checking the status of each fuse state in every flight loop frame all added up. And in an aircraft like this, each frame draw counts. And finally, we had to ask ourselves just how many pilots actually pull fuses, and also with what frequency. Those user case scenario questions are important to ask. Our most generous estimate was that out of curiosity, maybe 10% of all pilots pull a fuse at least once. And then of those 10%, maybe only 1 or 2% really pull a fuse more than 2 or 3 times maximum. So pulling fuses is not a regular activity, even in the real aircraft. Remember, there are no checklist items that require the pulling of fuses. So essentially, we'd be adding a lot of animation and coding, which would impact everyone's performance and FPS, just to be able to satisfy a handful of curious pilots, and for us to then be able to say in our marketing, all our fuses work? Well, yeah, that's not who we are. Others may do that to score marketing points, but that's just not us. What we absolutely coded is for all major systems to fail in realistic ways, which, by the way, is the only thing that pulling a fuse actually accomplishes. Triggering system failures can easily be done with the sim's failure menus, and that happens without charging everyone those extra FPS costs. So in other words, if you want failures, then feel free to set aircraft reliability in the SIMS menu, and then be prepared for systems to fail realistically, and you will have to take corrective action needed as provided for in the POH or our video tutorials. Your argument now may be, but other aircraft do this. True, and you'd be correct, but we are very intentional about where to spend FPS. We spent it liberally in places where a majority of pilots spend most of their time, on things like having a realistic gear blowdown coded and modeled in case of hydraulic failures, or moving the stabilizer that's authentically timed for the stab miscompare alert in the upfront annunciator panel, or having a very realistic, highly checklist-driven cold and dark startup. Or another one is modeling very realistic battery, electrical, APU, GPU integration and having true emergency backup instrumentation available to fly on an emergency panel. But to animate over 200 fuses for bragging points? Nope. We spent FPS in places that were super important for a majority of pilot experiences. Make sense? Anyway,
50, 40,
that's why we chose,
30.
intentionally and with forethought, not to code and
20.
animate 200 fuses in the
10.
circuit breaker panel. Case closed. Moving on. Here we go. Overall, as we step back, we see that the cockpit structure is an exact replica of the real C-560XL, down to its panel lines, colors, PBR textures, bump mapping, grunge, even the screw placements and the types and counts and sizes. It's all there. With its mix of modern glass instruments and dials and switches, there is always something interesting to do in the cockpit. And that's one of the main reasons for building this aircraft. We did not like the idea of pushing a couple of large dominating glass instruments around the sky, or the idea of turning the autopilot on 10 seconds after takeoff and then going to sleep for the next 10 hours. Those type of experiences are available elsewhere, but that is not the cockpit experience this jet offers. Instead, with about a 4-hour range, we wanted to give pilots some degree of automation, but also wanted to keep them active and to do things when flying. So, if that fundamental cockpit experience concept of doing things is not to your liking, then sadly this aircraft is probably not for you. But if you do like to do things throughout a flight, then this 99% bug-free, 95% authentic aircraft is definitely for you. Let's take a tour of the cockpit first, and then we'll transition into looking at the cabin. Up top, aside from some lights and vents, there are no instruments placed on the roof. The layout is quite simple, and that's the way Cessna designed it. The glare shield is textured to be realistically dusty and non-reflective. It has speaker housing, and there are small but fully functioning windshield warning icing lights where the down tube meets the glare shield, and we'll talk more about those a little bit later. Outside you can see the hot air windshield blowers. There are no wipers in this aircraft. It's worth noticing that this jet's rain streaks have been fully customized, so they are not huge drops of water. Here is a comparison of big water blobs and streaks in the default Baron. Glass covers all the instruments, and in informational number 1 we talk about how we have customized our reflections and how we compare them to the glaring white and bothersome reflections found elsewhere. So I won't repeat that same thing here, but just to summarize, we do not have options to turn reflections off because we maintain that our reflections enhance the C560XL's cockpit experience. They just don't get in the way. Both seats move. By the way, what you are seeing is not low resolution cushioning as suggested by some, but rather that's the cushion piling that has worn down by being sat on. It's always interesting to see cockpits that have pristine, never been sat in seat cushion textures. I guess to each their own. We try to make ours more realistic and flattened and look more used. Cockpits are not pristine work areas, and the C560XL is no exception. There are dusty, grungy, scruffed up places all over the cockpit. So too, our cockpit side panels and pockets, side windows, cabin windows are all scratched and grunge as expected, including, oops, a coffee spill left over from a previous flight. The rear bulkhead is equally authentically modeled, shaded, labeled, and has panels and screw placements and counts to match the real thing. We chose not to add door curtains. That's simply a low use but high object modeling texturing FPS saving decision. Turning to the sides, the jet has excellent side window vision, but the side windows are not animated, and that's just another FPS saving decision. But all the window paneling and labeling is authentic. From a layout point of view, the cockpit has 6 panels. The pilot side, the front center panel, the co-pilot's panel, and the center console or pedestrian series of paneling. Then there are 2 side panels. This would now be a good time to talk about the cockpit's lighting. First and most importantly, the main thing to remember about every light, everywhere in this aircraft, whether it's in the cockpit, the cabin, or even outside, their light comes from individual light bulbs. This is a key differentiator for this aircraft. Here is an example of what we do not do. These are 2D painted on light splashes in the default 737. These are all done in art programs like Photoshop or GIMP. On the other hand, every light you see in the C560XL is from real light bulbs, and every light bulb has been individually positioned, intensity and wattage tuned, connected to the jet's electrical system, and are all individually aimed and colored. The test to know whether a light splash you see comes from a real bulb is to look for areas of mixed coloring where lighting overlaps, or to see glows and reflections react to the movement of cockpit or cabin objects, as you are now seeing here, or here. Here's another example, or here. The C560XL has over 300, no joke, over 300 real 3D lights all over the aircraft, and every one of them are individually powered, directed, tuned, and colored to produce only real 3D light beams that cast reflections and colors that make true object reflections and adapt to changing day-night lighting conditions. It was painstaking, hard, meticulous work to install over 300 real light bulbs and required a lot of attention to detail, but we hope you will agree that it enhances every pilot's experience. We think this was a better use of time spent to enhance the experience of all pilots instead of animating the 200 fuses we just talked about earlier. Agreed it was a good trade-off? So, if you see a light casting light or an object reflecting light anywhere in the aircraft, know that those are from real light bulbs and real light beams and intensity tuned reflections, and that's what gives us a spectacular night flying experience. So, don't blame us if you fly more at night in this aircraft. So moving on, but still related to our realistic lighting in a big way, let's now take a minute to talk about this little custom-built day-night switch. It's really important to your overall cockpit experience in the C560XL. Now, we've seen many complaints about dark daytime cockpits and instruments since XP12 launched. This is an example in the default Airbus, and you'd be right. It looks pretty dark. Everyone's used to brighter cockpits like here in the C560XL in X-Plane 11. And just as a side, yes, we provide both XP11 and XP12 versions of the C560XL. Each has been extensively tested and tuned to be optimized for each SIM version. They're just not copies from one SIM into another. But when XP12 released, it made some rather big changes to its lighting model. So we did the work to change our XP12 C560XL version and solve the dark cockpit problem for the C560XL in XP12. Let's take a look at that. But quickly, let's change back to the default A330 in XP12, looking pretty dark, yes. And for comparison, here's the C560XL cockpit. Notice it's not dark. How come? Two reasons. First, we put a bunch of effort into daytime texture customization to make the cockpit look brighter. Notice the cockpit is very viewable during any time of the day. But now notice how the instruments are getting brighter as daylight fades. It's all the result of the custom work we did to balance cockpit and instrument brightness to make sure we have no dark cockpit issues. But you might now be saying, well, the instruments look dark in the day, that's a problem. Yes, but what you are seeing is the C560XL's instrument dulled for night flying. Well, so let's fix that instantly by using this little switch I mentioned. Yes, this aircraft has custom day and night brightness instrument flying controlled by this little switch. Watch this. If we flip it, it turns night instrument dimming off, so the instruments are brighter during the day. See the difference? Dark default cockpit versus bright C560XL daytime cockpit. There you go. Pilots have no more dark cockpit complaints when flying the AirSim3D C560XL aircraft. Score another big differentiator for this aircraft. But hold on, we are still not finished with the C560XL's lighting customization yet. Notice the effect of shadows on labels and instruments during the day. See how sunlight is absorbed and reflected back by the lettering when it's in the sun? Or how instruments have a completely dull look when in the cold and dark state with avionics off. Notice also the EL, or electroluminescence lighting. The parts of it that are in shadows reflects and glows so that the EL lighting is still all very readable in the shadows. We spent a lot of time to get these little lighting details done right. So hope you like all these custom 3D and other lighting enhancements in this aircraft. Now let's get deeper and explore the individual instruments in this cockpit. And just a reminder, we will review everything, but if you need how-to instructions, then please refer to our deeper focused how-to tutorials for instrument operations and real jet procedure instructions. But to summarize, this aircraft has all the instruments you will ever need to fly any flight plan you throw at it, including ones with SIDS, stars, precision ILS approaches, station-to-station VOR or ADF navigation, or even end-to-end GPS LNAV and VNAV flight plans with altitude and speed restrictions. And if you even want to navigate old school by dead reckoning by using the lighted wet compass on the down tube, then feel free to challenge yourself doing that too. By the way, while we are looking at the down tube, don't miss this little tray with the seating height indicator balls. Like everything in this jet, they have a purpose and they are precision modeled. Just as in the real jet, when the pilot sights the little white ball directly in front of the orange one behind it, his or her head is at the correct seat height and is then centered down the PFD. See, details matter. But if you go with the modern route, then the aircraft has a fully functional, authentic autopilot that works flawlessly. And it must also be flown realistically. So be sure to please study it before you try to use it. It provides heading, LNAV, precision Cat3 ILS approach and Mode C reporting capabilities with the custom RMU just above it. Backcourse navigation, VNAV, yes, VNAV works flawlessly, altitude hold, vertical speed, and custom flight profiled flight level changes. Oh yes, and our terrain radar and the weather radar will help you navigate safely too. There's also another highly customized SimPilot feature enhancement I should mention here, and it has to do with this little switch. Now, I won't go into detail here only because there is a separate detailed topic in our online pilot operating handbook and also a dedicated video in our tutorial series about this. But this is just to summarize that this switch changes the panel layout from a realistic mode to an augmented panel mode. And briefly, its purpose is to prevent forcing the pilot to have to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to view the AP in realistic mode, because that's what real pilots do. Okay, all right, okay, I'm going to stop doing that now. But the augmented mode also adds some functions like an auto throttle, which, by the way, the real jet does not have. So please take time to study the POH or our tutorials to learn more about what the realistic and augmented panels do and provide. And so there you have it, yet another differentiator for this aircraft. See, I told you we keep the customer experience front and center always. It's a guiding principle for us with everything we do. So what else about the cockpit experience? Here's a summary of all the authentic experiences you will have when flying this cockpit. Remember to please see the how-to tutorials to make everything work and function correctly. The cold and dark startup is completely replicated for real-world copied checklist governed starts. It's as real as it gets. Oh, by the way, all the sounds you hear with this aircraft are all custom FMOD engineered and real jet recorded sounds. The rest of the start panel with its pumps, generators, and ignition need all to be precisely set using the checklists when starting the engines or managing electrical and engine systems. There's a lot to learn here. The whole electrical system is replicated, including being able to isolate the cabin in an emergency, or to use the emergency battery instruments cluster. Try landing in bad weather at night using these instruments. It's quite a challenge and one that takes practice to perfect. The lighting panel is completely modeled. Panel section instrument dimmers, maps, floods, EL lighting, they all work. And we covered the very important day-night switch earlier too. You have a fully functioning real-world modeled GPU and APU to manage battery or starting power. Both of these can fail, or the APU even can catch fire. And don't miss the custom airframe and APU usage meters on this panel. Pilots will also have to manage fuel imbalances as a result of running the APU, since it uses fuel from only one tank. and then must use the realistically modeled cross-feed procedures to counteract that imbalance. There is no custom fuel management pop-out in this aircraft, but the fuel tanks, the pumps, the quantities, usage, passenger seating, and weights and balances are all authentically modeled. The jet's throttles, engine instruments, custom reverser unlock and deploy timing and stowing and annunciation are all perfectly and accurately lighted, modeled, and functional. If you have not already done so, watch informational number 1 to see a real-time engine fire emergency play out and the emergency procedure applied in real time. There is a small custom throttle indent indicator instrument left of the pilot PFD. We saw this installed on the real jet we visited at Boeing Field. This instrument is used to set the N1 target bug to remind pilots not to overread the engines. Remember we said red is bad? So this is the one that reminds you not to go into the red. So if you see anything red related to throttles, that's bad for the engines. So throttle back. Just below is a 4-function custom clock. It displays GMT local times and flight time. The flight time is started the moment the aircraft is airborne, and it's a really nice, neat way to log flying hours automatically, even if you do quick turnarounds. And of course, the stopwatch. By the way, pilot and co-pilot stopwatches operate independently. That little blue colored roundel is the cockpit microphone, which connects to the flight data recorders. The very prominently positioned 42-windowed annunciator panel is alert central for this aircraft. Each window is individually lighted with real 3D lights that we talked about earlier. Some windows serve dual purposes. See how the light colors and positions work? There can be over 90 alert scenarios that cause some or combinations of some annunciators and the master cautions and warnings to all light up or flash. Even their colors have meaning, so you'll definitely want to study and pay attention to them in the POH or the tutorials. A quiet and dark panel is what pilots want to see. That means everything is working well. We've already talked a little bit about the custom autopilot, and paired with the custom PFD and its AP annunciators on the top strip, pilots can get all critical speed, altitude, and attitude information they need. The lower half provides various data like wind data, courses set in the VORs or GPS, or vertical speed information. The jet also provides a flight path vector. This is usually found in HUDs or fighters, but we thought, what the heck, why not? There's a lot to learn here. Pilots will use the custom DME a lot for navigation or VOR and ADF station ID, distance, time, and closure information. And you'll find PFD functionality backup in the custom MFD. The MFD displays both rows and arc displays, radar changes, and has 6 submodes. It is also the place to find real-world replicated checklists that you will use a lot in this aircraft. It also has buttons to access the weather and terrain radar. Both the MFD and PFD had their own power sources, and that's all part of the checklists to turn them on at the right time. There is also a completely authentic 11-station pre-flight rotary test. Every station's test is accurately modeled, lighted, timed with real jet recorded sounds. There's a lot more in the tutorials about doing this test. Oh, by the way, the PFD, the MFD, and the G1000 can all be popped out of their windows. Click to open the top opens the PFD, and lower half opens the MFD. Explain does not allow the G1000 pop-up to be customized, so please ignore the incorrect engine data in the MFD. All that information is custom and correctly provided in the jet's engine instruments. Remember we advised earlier forgetting about the G1000 most of the time? Well, here's another reason why you should ignore it. The 3D lighted comm panel and radios are fully functional and enable pilots to hear and talk to ATC, auto-tune VOR, comm, ADF stations, and the transponder. Just make sure the speakers are not muted or you won't hear anything. The radio is also fully Mode C capable, so the VATSIM folks will be able to see your altitude in addition to your aircraft speed and ident. Just under are the fully functional artificial standby horizon and VORs. Check the glow they make at night. That's sweet. What else? Moving further down, we see the aircraft has a fully functioning and realistic wing engine and windshield icing system. These are accurately timed to heat modeled, just like the real jet, so you'll need to plan ahead. Windshield icing lights shine on at night to tell the pilot when the windshield is icing up. The aircraft has wing inspection and tail splash lighting along with all the usual nav, strobe, and taxi and landing lights required. Just remember that these are all real 3D lights, all tuned and directed. In addition to the regular taxi and landing lights, the C-560XL also provides custom pulse landing lights. Like the real aircraft, these are flight profiled. In other words, they have real-world conforming rules for automatically pulsing or changing to steady based on the aircraft's flight profile conditions, or they can also be automatically triggered to pulse by TCAS alerts. It's all very realistic. For passenger safety, the cabin has all the required cabin placards, and we'll see those when we get to the cabin in a minute. The aircraft can also automatically be configured for emergency egress lighting, complete with overwing shark lights. Listen to our first informational to learn why they are called shark lights by pilots. That's not really their official name, by the way. To the right is the 100% replicated 3-mode pressurization system. There's a lot to study here to operate it so as to not black out at over 10,000 feet, or to make sure that you had zero pressure difference when you land at your destination airport. This instrument is accurately flight profile modeled, and like all the major systems in this aircraft, it is tied to the upfront annunciator for critical red warnings. Immediately below it is the panel used to manage the air conditioning system. It provides separate cockpit and cabin heating and cooling and bleed air source control. There's a lot to learn on this section of the panel too. Further down, the elevator trim, flaps, speed brake, and other trim wheels all function. Moving to the rudder pedals and yoke, see the grunge and wear and tear? There's a lot of realism built in here, down to the 100% functioning yoke buttons, and yes, the TCS button works too. Don't miss the custom Cessna Mustang logo in the center, pretty cool. The yoke can be hidden by clicking this large, easy-to-get-to area on the front panel. And the yokes and pedals have lots of attention to detail with their custom grunge and bump mapping and custom materials and wear and tear. Again, since this is in the front of the pilot and used all the time, we invested the time and effort to make it look right and get it to work correctly too. Just below the pilot side dash are 4 important fully functional levers. The parking brake, well worn and used. By the way, there is no parking brake annunciation in this jet. The control lock works to lock the rudder and the front wheel. It's an important part of the startup and shutdown procedures. And the last 2 play a very important part in the authentically modeled hydraulic system failures to blow the gear down when it is time to land. And speaking of failures, all major system failures are 100% modeled. For example, electrical emergencies, pressurization event triggers like leaks or bleed air failures, or engine failures or fires, APU failures or fires, AC bearing failures. How reliable the aircraft is depends on the reliability setting in the sim, but when set, systems will and are likely to fail to test a pilot's skills. Off to the right, we mustn't forget the battery temperature gauge. It monitors the battery based on several factors like ambient air temperatures, airspeed, and charging rates. Okay, so there you have it, a cockpit with the mix of old and modern and with something for everyone to do. But hold on, the ability to do things, all this authenticity, real-world lighting, and functional reality also extends to the cabin too. If you looked at the first informational, you got a glimpse of the cabin, but let's go into it a bit deeper here. First, looking back from the cockpit, notice the sunken walkway design that is the result of the underbelly bulge design that we saw a lot of when watching Informational 1. This enables tall persons to easily stand upright in the cabin. Notice also that the entire cabin's sides and roofs and panels are all 3D textured. The window shades are 3D objects too, they are not painted textures. Similarly, the carpets and the seat cushions are all 3D modeled and bump mapped with true high-fidelity PBR materials. To the left, a coat closet, and on the right is the all-important main exit. The main exit can be opened or closed from either inside or outside. That's the sound of the pressure seal deflating as we unlock it. Opening it breaks the cabin sound insulation and then things can get pretty loud. It is 100% modeled and animated, true PBR textured, and has real sound recordings. At night, an open door casts light from the cabin to the tarmac. Just make sure to turn the entry lights on from the panel on the forward side of the door. Notice that the door pin and the up front panel annunciation is lit up when the door is not locked correctly. Now let's close the door from the outside this time so it's quieter in the cabin as we continue the walkabout inside. Turning the cabin lights on from the control panel configures the cabin to be fully lighted. But that lighting is different from the emergency egress lighting configuration that is automatically triggered and configured from the cockpit switches. All of these lighting scenarios are modeled and connected to the battery and electrical systems. So when the interior light switches off, the cabin is isolated from the electrical system and can become quite dark. Notice the exit lighting signage on the door sides and over the exit. Yes, there are the required seat belt and no smoking signs, and as a consequence of having only real lights that we talked about earlier, check out the bulb reflections from the real lighting on the fuselage from these panels. As with the cockpit, we use only real 3D lights in the cabin lighting too. There are no fake 2D pools of painted on lit or light textures. So what else? With the exception of the entry chair, all the other chairs can recline, all the tables fold out, and the window shades, they all work. There are real-world labels everywhere to be found in the cabin. That's attention to detail. There is a reading and table light for each chair, and check out the little real light glows on the armrests. Pretty cool. Because we have only real lights everywhere, notice the glow from the overhead reading lights as I move them about. The lav is authentically modeled, labeled, and animated too. The door needs to be stowed open for takeoffs and landings. Closing the lab door will also trigger the required upfront cockpit annunciator warnings. The wet wall does not open fully, and that's by design. These are supposed to be mirrors, and we've textured them as such, but admittedly, it looks kind of weird as it reflects only the cockpit and not the cabin. Hopefully XP will fix this anomaly at some point in the future, but if not, we might change them back to wood paneling at some point also. The emergency exit can be opened right up to the point of actually opening the door, but completely opening it is not modeled. We simply wanted to save the FPS, and this door is almost never open anyway. So there you have it, a complete cockpit and cabin informational walkabout tour. So if you want authentically modeled and 99% bug-free instrumentation and an aircraft that will fly any flight plan that you want to fly, If you want to fly what is probably the best night flying lighted experience, if you want to push yourself to learn real-world procedures using real-world checklists, if you want bright cockpit instruments at all times, if you want to hear real FMOD sounds that were recorded from the real jet, if you want a great and immersive experience that is completely pilot ready, then this aircraft is for you. And so, as Paul Harvey would say,
now you know the rest of the story.
Thank you for that, Mr. Harvey, and until we meet again in the next AirSim3D C-560XL informational or tutorial, good day.